Okay, good morning, everyone. My name's Gavin Starks. I'm going to be chairing our session this morning. Thank you all very much for joining. We're going to have a lot of people on the session today. We've had over 270 people sign up, and so far about 80 of them have made it into the room so far. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists and presenters today. My name's Gavin Starks. I'm the founder of Icebreaker One. We'll shortly be hearing from Julie Calkins, who's head of risk information from Climate Kick. Then Duncan Duffy, who's the global head of technology from Lloyd's Register. Vanessa Escobar, who's lead scientist for NOAA. Lisa Horrocks from Arup, and then Libomila from Plan A. I think just to set the scene today, what we're going to do is have a series of short presentations, and by short I mean 1 to 2 minutes from each of the speakers here, and then we're going to break into more of an open discussion. There is a chat room in Zoom. Given the number of people, we're not going to be letting people unmute their microphones because that will just add too much complexity to the logistics. But if you have questions, please drop them into the chat room and my colleagues here will pick them up and we'll try and weave them into the conversation as we go. I'm going to be running a few polls as well during the session to get some sentiment of what we're all thinking. They'll all be very time limited, but we'll share all of the outputs after we finish the session. Also, the whole thing is being recorded. So assuming that recording works, we'll also share that back out to the community once it's finished. So to kick off, so Icebreaker One is an independent non-profit, and we're really focused on helping to bridge the data gaps between the science, policy, finance, and engineering that's going to help us deliver net zero. And it's a really difficult challenge. I think I'd just like to flag up some of the complexities that we're dealing with. We have 2 major programs underway at the moment. We're working across agriculture, the built world, transport, energy, and water. We've got a major program which is funded by the UK government called SERI, which is looking at developing a standard for environmental risk and insurance, which is spanning quite a number of those areas. And there the kind of complexity is, what information can we glean from and gather from, for example, the built world, which Lisa will talk about a bit more in a moment, that could inform the financial products or insurance products that are taking that can help us drive towards net zero. So that program, which we're in the middle of at the moment, is a year-long research and discovery project to design, build, and test what we've called a climate-ready financial product, and really shake the tree and see like what's possible, and can we move from the top-level sort of principles of and practice of the policy instruments right the way to how do we instrument this? How do we instrument the change? The second program, which we're also just at the beginning of, is around open energy. We're here across the UK, again, another UK public funded program, is how do we develop open standards that can enable data sharing across the entire energy sector? And this is almost a little bit easier to get your heads around. You've got lots of sources, you've got lots of sources of energy supply, we've got lots of energy demand, and you've got lots of intermediaries, and the number of actors in that system is only going to increase. And at the moment, data is either not shared very effectively, or it's poor quality, or it's not necessarily wiring up to help us drive towards net zero. So there's a big program of work there where we're consulting with the entire UK market around what would the potential of that system be. And I said, we're going to keep these introductions quite short, but I just want to pick up on one piece of terminology. One of the things that we find really challenging in the journey here is when we talk about data, lots of people use the word open to mean different things. Lots of people get sort of mix up personal data and big data and AI and technology and so on. We really want to be clear here about what we're talking about in terms of the ability to share data is based on what permissions do I have to use it. And so there's a context here of open data, and I used to run the Open Data Institutes, and we defined open data as data that can be used by anyone for any purpose for free. So that's a very specific set of information. There's closed data, which requires a specific license, a custom contract, if you like, bilateral contract to enable people to use it, which is where the majority of data sits at the moment. And really what we're interested in here is what we've called shared data. And shared data from our perspective is data that has a preemptive license for a specific use. And the example I draw on here is we've helped to create, or I helped to create in the past, a standard called the Open Banking Standard. And that has enabled the entire banking sector to share its information across the sector in a secure and safe and managed environment, but without creating a central portal into which all the data has to go. All the individual actors, and there's now hundreds of organizations in that ecosystem, hold their own data, and then they agree common ways of sharing it across the network. So shared data for us is something that if we believe if we can help to unlock the kind of preemptive use cases here, addressing the risk and controls elements of that, then we can start to build a web of data that is useful to everyone. I'm going to pause now and pass on to Julie for her quick introduction. Julie, do you want to now take the stage and give us your view of the world?
Thank you. I did send you some slides, I think.
I haven't got them in time, so please.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Well, you would be seeing a slide of Climate Kick at the moment. So we're an innovation agency with European roots and a community of innovative organizations, including Icebreaker One, and I see some of our partners also in the audience today, which is great. And we're dedicated to unlocking a rapid transformation to a net zero and resilient future. So at Climate Kick, I run our strategic portfolio focused on resilience. And I particularly push on these interrelated levers of finance, data, and culture change. And we do this in a systems approach. So if you could see my slide, you would see we take these different levers and we approach different interventions simultaneously. And we know that strengthening resilience to climate shocks and stresses needs to embrace this complexity, the multiple layers and across scales of resilience. And we need to make connections between many multiple systems, whether you're talking about health systems or transport or energy or a variety of things that kind of govern our lives and allow us to live. And unlocking change needs really these multiple interventions with data and finance. If we think of finance as incentives and costs to action or inaction, really interwoven into every intervention that we take. So my focus is really on democratizing information, unlocking insights with good enough data through establishing standards and proxies, this kind of frugal or minimalist innovation, so that the barriers of cost, capacity, capability are lower. Anyone can use it, anyone can do it. And I do this because I have two understandings of the world. One is that we will never have perfect and complete data. So how do we work with what we have? Can we live with the upside or downside risk of the precision lost, not having the best information? And two, that access to information in itself can be transformative. So now we're in the age of crises. I don't think that's going anywhere. An age of systemic failures. And we can imagine a culture shift where information and understanding of systemic risk due to climate change, options for resilient investment, civil planning actions, large and small, are available to all of us and embedded in our daily life and function. And I think particularly now, yeah, the delayed COP, which I think is a blessing. No one was excited about the COP that was intended for this year. We have the UK presidency of the G7. We have the shift in the Overton window that we've seen. And we have a once-in-a-lifetime fiscal opportunity in COVID recovery, and this greater awareness really of systemic risk and particularly tail risk that are all in favor of ambitious action. So if we take COVID as a flash forward, showing humanity on its business as usual destiny, an intensification of our current path, clearly we aren't ready for it. We aren't ready for the climate crisis, and we weren't ready for this, and we have every reason in the world to divert that future. With that, I'll pass to Duncan. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And I did manage to grab your slides there as we went. So just before we get to Duncan, I'm going to launch our first poll to keep everybody interested and engaged. So the first question I'm going to ask here is, do you feel that your organization is what I would call climate ready? Now, just before I launch that poll, I'll just drop into the chat room there. That's our definition of climate ready is there, but let me launch that now. And we'll run that for a few minutes, but while you're all filling that in, we'll go back to Duncan. Let me just get the presentation up here and we'll pass over. Duncan.
Yes, that's me. Good morning, everyone, or perhaps good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Oh, I've not really again.
I'll try and go forwards instead of backwards. There we go.
I work for Lloyd's Register's marine and offshore business, which is a commercial entity, but like our other business areas, that's wholly owned by the Lloyd's Register Foundation, which is a charity registered in the UK and dedicated to furthering safety and education around that area. So that's a little on structure. What I was going to do is just give you a little bit of an introduction to the scope of challenge within shipping, and to tie that into what that has to do with London International Climate Week is shipping is a demand-driven business. So things don't get moved unless there's demand to move them and a market for moving them. If you take the example of container traffic on the graph there, that's millions of tons of CO2 emitted by global container shipping, international shipping in the year 2012. There's some studies that have shown that if we continue using fossil fuels, which is largely what is powering shipping at the moment, the emissions could increase by up to about 250%, depending exactly on which scenario comes in there. So the UN body that regulates shipping, the International Maritime Organization, have looked at this and set binding targets to reduce emissions. And we in Lloyd's Register see that as a part of an overall energy transition. So in order to make those decisions, we need to be able to understand the available technologies that might enable that, and certainly continued use of fossil fuels is not one of them, but also how those technologies will influence communities, so whether they're actually acceptable to society. An example of that might be that clearly nuclear is a low carbon energy option, but it's not necessarily societally acceptable. And certainly there's areas of the world where it would not be. As well as that, the majority of the options for this transition would be a change in fuels. So either synthetic liquid fuels developed from biomass and other areas, or a changeover to something like hydrogen or ammonia. All of them involve technology challenges, particularly that it's not just for the ships themselves, but also the infrastructure. There needs to be production, distribution on land to enable ships to use those alternatives. So tying that back in again to how that impacts cities, the UK has container traffic coming in through Felixstowe, Southampton, Port of London, Immingham, other places as well. I think the total number of containers was in excess of 9 million 20-foot equivalent units. That's the small boxes rather than the long boxes that you see on the back of trucks. So that was shipped from Asia to North Europe in 2017. And that demand is what delivers the Amazon boxes to your door, or the clothes to Primark that you can currently queue up to have the option to buy. So there's issues that are outside of shipping around how do we change the model that puts that demand onto shipping. And probably both of those are needed to achieve the type of transition that we're aiming for.
Super.
Thanks, Gavin.
Thanks, Duncan. Very good. Again, the one reflection on this is when companies are trying to assess their individual company carbon footprints, when you look at Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, for most organizations, the vast majority of their emissions are in their supply chain. They're in the Scope 3 element here. And this is fundamentally a data sharing problem for me. If you simply can't get access to the global supply chain information without some extremely heavy lifting. And we need to make that much easier as we go forward. Let me now come on to Vanessa. Vanessa, would you like to take us forward from here?
Good morning, and yes, thank you, Gavin. Hello to everyone. Good morning and afternoon. So my name is Vanessa Escobar, and I'm a user engagement scientist both at NOAA and at NASA. I find this panel exciting because the topic of discussion on open data, access to data, and just general availability to information is something that we as a satellite organization have to be very sensitive to. And my role is to provide translation and be able to target information more effectively for the users. Satellite data oftentimes is very challenging in terms of access, applying, downloading, and possibly even understanding. And so what I do is work with the end user community, specifically agriculture, human health, transportation, energy, risk, flood detection, flood management, across a broad array of users, and try to provide an understanding and look at the data from the perspective of the end user. And so there's going to be value in the information, but it's going to be very subjective. And so the value in the information is not only from the decision-making that the user has with the information, but it's also mapped to specific goals within that organization. And Gavin, if you advance the slides, you could probably see just a simple image that looks at rediscovering, redesign, redefining. Oftentimes we say don't reinvent. And the reinvention has led us to more improved, more targeted, and oftentimes better outcomes or products. And so we look at data and we try to redefine it and reassess it from the perspective of the user and try to communicate it in that way. And so satellite data for climate obviously being enormously valuable. By making data more transparent and making the user aware of errors and the confidence behind the data, and by making it more accessible and put it into formats that are more digestible, we can then help support organizations that are trying to get to that net zero. So my role here is really framing translation and connection across our relationships to ensure that the science is digestible and that we find value in the information.
Super, thank you very much. And I think just again to reflect on that, I think we're all aware that there's many initiatives in the world that kind of take a technology first approach, or they ask for the data to be made available, but they're not necessarily that specific about which data for what purpose. And so identifying the actual user needs is the first step in this. You know, when we're trying to address what is going to create a climate-ready future, we really need to understand and ask ourselves the question, what are we really building for? So with that, I'm going to pass over to Lisa to give us an insight from Arup's perspective.
Great, thanks very much. I'm hoping that many of you on this session will have heard of Arup before. Arup's an independent firm of designers, planners, engineers, architects, consultants and technical specialists working across every aspect of the built environment. And I'm a member of a climate resilience, climate change and circular economy team within Arup. And we find within Arup that sustainable development, including climate action, is central to all our work. For us, sustainable development makes total business sense, not least because there's a strong link with better quality, better planning, more collaboration, and a deep focus on operational outcomes and performance. And with that focus on outcomes, we can unpack real, coherent opportunities for decarbonisation and resilience in built environment and infrastructure. Perhaps it's integrating schemes for water recycling or sustainable drainage, energy use, green space or heat management, looking for ways to employ circular economy principles within design, and at the same time securing those additional benefits that can come from these interventions, like community value and biodiversity and enhanced quality of life. And digital is truly a key enabler for this kind of holistic approach, not only in the modelling, which might first come to mind, but also to facilitate the data access, the data transformation, and the creation of useful insights for collaborative decision making. So for example, if we want to consider the carbon and resource use and resilience, not just of individual buildings, but of an entire district, well then we need meaningful collaborations across multiple stakeholders involved in that district. And if we want to manage climate risks across the entire lifetime of a building or infrastructure or district, well, we need to share that data and curate that data in appropriate ways from those multiple stakeholders through time. So the rapid advances that we're seeing now in digital technology do have the potential to give us this collaboration for the innovation that we need to address climate change.
Super. And Lisa, you were discussing earlier about Arup's sort of strategic vision now being very much underpinned by both the climate agenda and the digital agenda.
That's right.
How is that being kind of framed now from a top-down level within the organization?
Well, I think it's one of those core values that really holds an organization like Arup together, with more than 14,000 employees around the world. We're known for quality. We're known for a holistic approach to challenges in the built environment. We call that total architecture or total design. We're known for collaboration. And within all of that, sustainable development is really everything that we do. And we talk further about what sustainable development means, or we can narrow it in for the purposes of today on what climate ready means. But really, it's about meeting the needs of a growing population and maintaining the health of the planet that we live on.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I'd also reflect, and we can maybe, I'm going to try and stimulate some questions on the chat. One of the initiatives that I'd say was technology first, that from my perspective failed because of its technology first approach, was the idea of smart cities. And I think there's various architectural components to that which we underestimated the importance of developing user needs first in that. And I think what we're now starting to see with organizations like Arup is this very kind of focus on the large scale challenges that we're trying to face, and then how do we instrument them as a mechanism to resolution. Now, our final speaker for today is Lumba Mila from Plan A. Do you want to give us your perspective?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much for the invitation. Plan A is a Berlin-based company that has been building different products to help businesses and individuals understand the data behind climate change and take action based on it. We built two products in particular that I would like to highlight. One is an algorithm that predicts where and how climate change will hit the hardest. This algorithm is based off 300,000 data points related to oceans, forests, wildlife, sustainable living, sustainable energy, and waste management. And the aim of this algorithm has been to help large companies think of the next 20 to 30 years and identify what kind of actions they can take to make their supply chain more green, but also understand what access to natural resources, how access to natural resources is going to shift and how they can make it more, I would say, kind to the planet in terms of the choices that they make. We notice, and I'm really excited about the discussion we're going to have, a lot of gaps in the data, and this is one of the big challenges we have ahead of us, as mentioned also by the other speakers. One thing that we also noticed in terms of our work with these companies when we were working with them to identify what's going to happen in the next 20 to 30 years was that they're also not prepared for the shorter term challenges that they face. So we have built another product that is a software that helps companies calculate, monitor, and reduce their emissions while also save costs. How this works is that we automatically take the data of a company on a scope 1, scope 2, and partially scope 3 level to then build a dashboard for them, give them an idea of how they're performing against other industry benchmarks, and then give them an understanding of what kind of actions they can take to tangibly reduce their emissions by minimum 50% within a year. We also cover scope 3, but for this we build particular modules according to the industry that we cover. I'm incredibly excited to be here and to tell you a bit more about the challenges we face and also the opportunities we see in data addressing the net zero challenge ahead of us. I think there's plenty of incredible innovation that we can benefit from, but there's a massive need for more collaboration between the different stakeholders. And in my opinion, the regulatory framework needs to move a bit faster to demand from businesses to look at their data and understand their carbon footprints and their impact on our planet.
Super, thank you very much. So I'm going to now lead us into the panel discussion, and we've got questions coming in, but just while we're doing that, I'm going to launch another poll. So this poll is going to ask the question, what is the main barrier, or what are the main barriers to organizations addressing climate change? And we've made this so you can pick more than one answer, but I'd like you to pick two so we can get a prioritization out of here. So I'm just going to launch that now, and then I'll come to some of our first questions here. So Duarte asked the concept of democratizing access and understanding climate change data is very important to us at climate scale. And this question to Julie. You mentioned you work with good and reliable data. What do you mean by this?
Thanks for the question, Duarte. I think it really depends is the answer, and that's a bit of a waffle. I am more on the MacGyver side of resourcefulness and looking for data that already exists to be put to better use as opposed to making new data. So, for example, we have done some interventions that have looked at can we make marginal improvements by creating new data, but mostly we're looking at existing data that might have been, for example, collected for a different purpose to answer a proprietary question, but that could be repurposed actually quite easily into something else. And we've done particular interventions around that, for example, with insurers and risk models to look at where you know, that data could be exploited further, and really trying to start there before we make something new.
Super, thank you. And again, if you want to ask follow-up questions, please feel free as well. I'm going to move on to the next question here, which I'll probably come to Lisa and Duncan on, from William. Is it feasible to introduce wind sail or even turbines together with solar PV and electric drives to the shipping fleet? What's the sort of order of magnitude involved, or is it kind of ridiculous to think that that's possible, even though we kind of used it several hundred years ago in the development of shipping? Is that something that's in flight, or tell us more?
It's certainly in flight. We're actually seeing things like rotor sails rather than the more conventional fabric sails being put on commercial vessels to give an improvement in fuel efficiency. We all know what vessels look like that are purely sail driven, so it isn't actually giving you the full power to move the cargo, but perhaps a 5-7% improvement can be achieved.
Right.
And while electrification, the use of batteries on ships is certainly an option that works well for some short sea applications, the energy density and the need then to regularly recharge, effectively refuel, means that it's not currently looking practicable for the deep sea and the sort of Asia-Europe, Asia-America trades. So there we're looking more at these alternative fuels as this technology pathway, but then we have to consider that alongside the investment readiness and the in some instances the community readiness to accept those swap-in technologies.
Super, thank you. And Lisa, linked question maybe to this, of linked to modeling and digital twins. Steve Field asks about building information modeling, and how does that align with the Sustainable Development Goals? What's your view there?
Yeah, thanks. I've just, so to be completely open and honest with the entire gathering here, I've just quickly Googled what is the future of BIM. For those who don't know, it's building information modeling. It's a digital approach to really bringing together all the data that you might need during the design and construction process around a building. And I'm not by any means an expert in BIM. It seems to me it's a great opportunity to draw in multiple other data sets too. At the moment, they're certainly within the UK context. There's a link very clearly with emissions. But we have to remember, when we think about climate change, we're looking often much wider than an individual building. And we're wanting to find ways to collaborate and share data, not just within the context of an individual building perhaps, but with multiple other stakeholders and actors within the urban realm. So it seems to me it's a good start, but it wouldn't necessarily be everything, and it perhaps doesn't stretch into those other sectors that also need to engage on this issue.
Super, and just to build on that, both the BIM context, building information modeling, and this idea of digital twins is really fundamental, I think, to the future of modeling. As Lisa was highlighting, it's not just looking at the individual asset and its model, but also looking at it in the context of the broader environment in which it is sitting. You know, building a, as Florida is discovering with flooding, you can make a very resilient building. It doesn't really help if the entire environment on which you're sitting is porous and the water comes up through the ground and shuts everything else down. So there's a whole set of elements there that are to do with the resilience and adaptation agenda. But I think here, you know, one of the areas that we were just discussing yesterday on our SERI program was looking at data centers and whether or not we could incorporate how would we incorporate net zero into the design of buildings to reuse the heating and cooling within the broader environment. So taking more of a systems view there is one of the things that I think greater access to data will enable us to do. Let me move on to well, let me maybe ask to the panel. We've had a poll there of what are the main barriers to change. The thing that came out top of that was siloed thinking and lack of collaboration. Vanessa, can I get you to talk to collaboration from NASA through NOAA into industry, and how is that functional, and how might it be improved?
You know, I hate to say I'm not surprised by the results of that. As much as I would love to see that number go down, it very much is a challenge, I think, internal NASA and NOAA, as well as, you know, the external bodies trying to collaborate with us versus us trying to collaborate out. You know, as scientists, we just have a reputation of working in our little bubble, and that is something that we are definitely trying to correct. And so through NOAA and through NASA, there are various user engagement groups. And so user science, decision science was never really a thing. It's never really even been a title until recently. And I have to say, over the last 10 years, I've been with NASA and NOAA 11 years now collectively, but I've worked in decision science almost 20 years to date myself. So it's now evolved into a very well-known field of science, where the social science of communication, assessment of qualitative and quantitative data for applying to decisions has become a reality, and merging that with the development of missions and science is now something that NASA and NOAA are very strong about doing. I do think that our awareness of our user engagement internally disconnects with what people know of NOAA and NASA. I don't think it's obvious that we have this user engagement science kind of growing within the organization. And so I think it's up to us to make that visible and transparent, and just very outward looking in terms of being open to feedback and recommendations, and understanding the user need, and being very honest about where satellite data can be applied, where it's actually going to be successful and provide information that is relevant, and where it doesn't scale to particular pain points. And I don't think it's an issue to say this satellite product does not address your need. I think it's very necessary to do that, because we then are respectful of the resources in, you know, trying to find valuable information. So again, I think it's something that we have to take on ourselves to improve the collaboration and help people understand our internal efforts to bring in external non-government, non-federal users and provide that bridge. And so that's the role. I'm hoping that through our discussion today, it just gets us one step closer to a new understanding that user engagement is very much an active effort across both organizations. And so, you know,
yeah,
trying to increase the collaboration every way possible. But
so
yeah,
that leads us very neatly into the next question. I'm going to come to Julie in a second. This is from Genevieve, who asks, how do we think we can create the right incentives for all stakeholders to participate? Now that happens to coincide with our next poll. So I'm going to launch that while Julie's talking to that point. Please vote away there. So Julie.
Oh, good. I see all of the levers that we've used in this poll, which is great. Thanks for the question. I also wondered whether Lisa might want to come in on this, because I think it might have been intended for her. So I think around incentives, we work on understanding the real needs that everyone has around an issue or a failure. What is forcing for everyone? What is the thing that is forcing them down the path that they're on now? Why they can or can't or can only do something. And the way that we do this in Climate Kick, and I know Icebreaker One uses user cases to really try to get at this. In Climate Kick, we do deep demonstrations at a system level. So this could be a region as a system of systems, a city as a system of systems, a community, a sector, a nation even. And by working at that level and try to understand what all of the forcing factors are within that, and how we can come up with incentives that you know, in some way work for everyone, even if some of them are longer term, or you know, some will require much bigger shifts than others.
Great, and I'll come to Lisa on that as well. But my quote of the week, I was on a climate finance webinar this week, and someone asked how much money has actually gone into financing the Paris Agreement, to which the response was none, absolutely none. So I think that gives us a sense of, you know, where there are ambitions and incentives that are maybe misaligned. Lisa, do you want to come into that, and then I'll come to Lubomila as well?
Yeah, thanks. So from my experience on working on, particularly on climate change adaptation projects over quite a large number of years now, it's not hard to get quite a wide range of stakeholders involved in some way to influencing projects, engaging in with them. It's much harder to translate the sort of the goodwill into real concrete action, and I think the way to do that is actually well, the way we've done it to date, and I'll come to where Icebreaker 1 is maybe trying to do things a little differently, but where we've been to date is really to try to communicate the benefits, where they may be ancillary benefits of being involved, either in sharing the data or making a change. They may be recognizing the benefits of doing this as a collaborative effort rather than just one by one. So that's one way to do it, is to focus on the sort of the practical, tangible outcomes that could be achieved. I think with Icebreaker 1, we're kind of trying to cut to the chase a little bit, maybe, and see how can we find those incentives in the form that really speaks, in other words, in the sort of the pound signs or the dollar signs. And if we come to my example of whether we look at addressing climate risks at the level of an individual building or across a whole district, then we could perhaps see some opportunities there if a district comes together to share data and address those issues like decarbonisation and resilience, and that can be communicated back to, for example, an insurance provider, and result in perhaps more favourable opportunities to receive insurance, or alternatively to receive onward investment into the future, because the district as a whole is recognised as a resilient and attractive place to be. Then we can start to trace through, I think, some of those quite tangible benefits. But we're just at the start of this, and that's one of the things that's exciting about Icebreaker 1, is how can we look at ways to share those data and really trace through some of those tangible benefits. And I think this links to another question that came up in the chat around the incentive to share data as well. So maybe we'll touch on that too.
And let's come to Lubomila, and then I'll bring in some other narratives.
In terms of incentives for businesses, what we have noticed is 3 particular topics being important for them. One is cost cutting. We have been able to connect sustainability and becoming more sustainable as something that also leads to saving money, and obviously in an economic situation where we are now, it really is something that they buy as a feature of the product. Another, I think, movement that we've seen on the market across the world has been the employee pressure. If you want to be successfully keeping your employees involved and excited, you really need to show that you have values that you support, and you really understand the importance of sustainability as part of your agenda. And finally, I would say also is the customer pressure. I know that the other panelists have mentioned incentives from another perspective, but definitely from the business one, these are the 3 ones that have heavily influenced the decision making and have pushed them into deciding to go into positioning themselves as a sustainable business, introducing some commitments to reduce their emissions, and also improving their behavior in terms of supply chains and natural resources use.
Great, thank you. I just want to reflect on the poll results there. So the majority voted for regulation as a driver to behavior shift. And I think that's something we'd very much echo, is regulation has to be part of the future here, because data is, not all data should be open. And as soon as you say not all data should be open, you need some common rules around which we can all agree to share without the sky falling or things catching fire. And in some cases, literally, I mean, again, even within banking, it's pretty important not to have, it's very important to have common and shared rules, but that becomes even more important when you're dealing with other types of infrastructure like energy, where keeping the lights on is paramount. Going to come on to the next question here from Maxine, who asks, despite the number of data initiatives, most people still say that lack of data is the biggest impediment. What's the best way of turning the data and all the different initiatives into useful information that can be used for business decisions? Who'd like to have a go at that? Duncan, do you want to come in first on that?
Well, data for business decisions, I think there's two parts for it. It was Julie said earlier on, good enough data for the purpose is an important consideration, because you need to know that your decision is not being made on a shaky foundation, if you will. So the quality of the data itself, and you've got things like the FAIR principles for data, which is around where you can collect it from, but also how the data actually works together. So provision of context so that you can actually then base the decision. But I think the right data is one part of that. The second part is the right conceptualization of the decision making that you're going to do. So you have to start bringing in, looking at ship as a system in my world example wouldn't be sufficient to make decisions about transition fuels, because you need to know that the system to supply those fuels is also going to be there. So when you look at the likes of an investment decision in that area, it has to understand the full system of supply.
Super. Julie, do you want to come in on that too?
Sure. I mean, we've spent a lot of time and interventions around Europe and around the world on developing all kinds of schemes where different types of metrics and labeling and standards are created to try to come in, whether it's an EPC type of certificate for resilience or something that goes into a mortgage that brings data into that type of decision making. We've done quite a lot of that with varying success and adoption. I think, like, reflecting on the poll results just before, I would really query whether it is data that's at the heart of the inability to act. And the two that have come out here, and I've been on similar calls in the last week, pointing to regulatory and customer demand or competitors movement, tells me it's really about early adopter risk and not wanting to be the first one, and having some assurance that this is good enough data to act. And yes, data will get better, but that's not an excuse not to do anything now. So I think that signal needs to come, essentially.
Great. I think I'd reflect that as well. It actually very neatly leads us into our next poll, which is, what are the biggest blockers to data sharing? I think my direct experience in this space as well is there are lots of initiatives, and it's a very natural thing for large organizations or countries or the EU to say, well, let's build a big data portal in order to get all the data together, and then we'll work out what to do next. Those initiatives, in my opinion, never work because they're not driven by user needs. And I think from our looking at the open banking standard, it was driven by a very particular set of needs for across the industry. There were regulatory requirements from GDPR, there were European regulatory requirements, but also there were genuine consumer benefits and genuine industry benefits from creating a more federated and collective action ecosystem. But again, looking at one of the other questions there, which mentioned the sort of distributed ledgers and blockchains, it didn't require a technology solution to create a federated system. You know, creating open APIs, to use the jargon, open endpoints, if you like, is reflective of the architecture of the web. And here, you know, we must remember that the most successful information architecture in history is the web. We've enabled billions of websites to connect. We've enabled more than half the world's population to connect. And so that architecture seems to somehow whistle by some of the strategic and policy decisions that can get made at supranational levels, when actually what we're trying to promote here, and particularly with the open energy piece as an example of a multi-stakeholder federated standard for interoperability, rather than put everything in one place. One of the benefits there would be, if you do actually have a federated standard for interoperability, you can also build the platform to put everything in one place. And the transition, if you like, is one from a conception model of everybody has to push something somewhere to, if you want data, you can go and pull it. You know, when you're using the web, you go out and find what you need when you need it, and gather it together and use it. You don't ask everyone to send you everything all the time. And so that sort of pull dynamic is a much more effective way, I think, for enabling us to create a federated ecosystem. Let's see now, get some more questions. Let me just look at that poll. So in our poll, lack of incentives is currently trending as the top, but also organizational culture. And I think, and user needs, in fact. So all of the things we've been talking about here, it's not the quality necessarily of the data, it's not even necessarily the technical systems, it's a culture change challenge and an incentive challenge. So let me just share the results there, which is really at the heart of this. So let me just pull up another question here. Let's come back to the question on costs. Maybe if I can go on to Lubomila and then Julie again, maybe on the discussion around costs. What's the cost of change here?
Short term, that is somewhat high, I would say, because we need to adapt our technologies, we need to adapt our infrastructure, but the longer term benefits outweigh the cost that we would have to pay now. And we can actually reduce significantly the cost if we collaborate amongst the different stakeholders, because if only the business bears the costs and the government maybe adapts regulations a bit later or doesn't give incentives, then certainly the costs are going to be higher. So I would say we need to start thinking about sustainability as in the longer term. I know that these are challenging economic times due to COVID and due to the fact that we have effectively stopped existing in an economical term for a few months as a society. But the longer term and kind of how we've adapted, at least in our product, is that every little step that you can take to become more sustainable can save you immediately or in the longer term a lot of costs, and there's data behind that.
Super. Julie?
Thanks. Yeah, I think, I mean, I have a different lens on cost, and it would be more about whether what your whether your actual value is built on sand, essentially. And we've seen a bubble burst already in our lifetime, and we think around what we have today versus what we'll have tomorrow. But if actually what we have today is on the cliff's edge, with assets being stranded, yet you end up owning legacy assets you can't protect, all over the place and at every level. So I think thinking through what it costs is also taking an assumption around value today that's probably not real, that it excludes a lot of externalities. And so I think, you know, what we've been talking around data and creating this infrastructure is the ability to create some kind of resilience mechanism, a learning mechanism that lets us look at our systemic risk, that lets us look at systemic risk in the financial system. So we know how close we are to the cliff edge, and we can create that preparedness capability and that infrastructure to look at and manage our failure risk better and to recover faster, which could save us money from today. Actually, it could save us real value from today.
Thank you. Right, we've got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to come round all of our panelists to have a one-sentence ask. If you could wave a magic wand, what's the one thing you would like to see? But just as we roll into that, I'm going to do a couple more polls. One around which groups are most likely to engage in systemic change. But while we're doing that poll, just in the last couple of minutes, let me go around the room, and hopefully you've had enough time to think of something. But let's start with Vanessa. What's your one ask for the world? With no poverty of ambition, I'd say as well.
The desire to come off mute faster. So listening to this discussion and hearing the value of incentivizing data for collaboration, you know, the incentives of cost cutting and really the cost of change versus, you know, doing zero. What I would ask is to have a more clear understanding through engagement, have a more clear understanding of how we can successfully map satellite data into the specific incentives and decision-making structures of the users here that are focused on climate. Clearly, NASA and NOAA having global data and readily available and free, there might be an underuse of the data. And so making sure that it is being used in a targeted style and that it is not wasting the resources, that it's just digestible. So for us, it's really making the connections and making sure that we're answering the right questions.
Okay,
so
I'm going to interrupt you because we've got 1 minute left, so I can get one sentence from our
that was a lot.
panelists. That'd be great. Duncan, what's your one sentence ask for the world?
I'll try and make it a long sentence then. I'd like to see the concepts around Build Back Better applied at all system levels. So not just at infrastructure, but also at government and also in the data supply chain, so that we can start getting the information needed to really address some of the challenges. Brilliant.
Libomila.
I would like for GHG emissions that are the result of a company ordering something in another geography to fall within the bill of the country from where the order comes from, because we have a lot of, I would say, unfair discussions about what we need to reduce and who should be at the helm of taking care of that. We are a lot more responsible than many other geographies, yet again we use them for our production sites. So yeah.
Excellent. Julie?
I think, yeah, being resourceful, creative, repurposing and using what we have is in some ways what we need to do.
Excellent. And Lisa, last but not least.
Thanks. I'd like to see an increase in perhaps a new sphere of working, which we might term systems engineering, which allows people to work across disciplines and allows particularly early careers people to combine their concern for climate action with deep technical skills in engineering and digital technologies.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you very much. And we'll post up a summary of the session and hopefully the recording as well in the near future. If there are any other questions you've got, feel free to get in touch with us. My email is just gavin@icebreaker1.org. If you'd like to connect with us, we can also then connect questions to other panelists. If you'd like to follow what we're doing and get invitations to either participate in the work that we're doing or hear about other research that we're undertaking, please do sign up to our mailing list. It's low frequency and short and to the point. So feel free to join up there. And we will be doing further webinars over the course of our work over the coming months. So we'll send out notifications via those channels too. So leaves me to just say thank you very much to our panelists for their insights and expertise, and thank you all for attending and staying with us for this hour. I'll end us on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you.
So much.